It looks like we're slowing down on participants coming in. First of all, thanks for everybody showing up. My name is Brian Lipscomb. I'm the CEO for Energy Keepers. We're the entity responsible for operating, managing, and maintaining the Salish-Kosonka-Kalispell hydroelectric project, which is just located 4.5 miles downstream from the outlet of Flathead Lake. I'm excited to join you here today, along with our partner agencies, to provide you an overview of our part of the Columbia Basin hydroelectric system and how it is operated and managed. More specifically, the unique and challenging conditions of 2022, 2023, and their resulting outcomes, and what we're currently seeing as we look at 2024. I appreciate you joining us to learn more about the situations we all face as the impacts of global temperature changes continue to manifest themselves here in our homelands. As we proceeded through last year, we heard clearly that more timely communication of impacts was needed. We agree. Today, we will be the first of many collective efforts on all of our parts to keep you all informed as we continue forward down this path of adjustment. We hope that by the end of this series of presentations, you'll have a clearer understanding of the legal constraints that are required in the operation of the Salish-Kosonka-Kalispell project, as well as how its operations are coordinated to meet the various competing objectives prevalent in water management here locally and regionally. Not only will we summarize the unprecedented conditions from 2022 and 2023, we will also provide a forecast for what we might expect for 2024. And lastly, some thoughts and resources to expect as we continue forward. I'll now turn it over to the Bureau of Reclamation for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Carrington, and I serve as the Regional Director for the Bureau of Reclamation's Columbia Pacific Northwest region. Western Montana falls within the Columbia River Basin, so I'm here today with my team from Reclamation to talk to you about the Flathead Basin and how we operate Hungry Horse Dam within the greater Columbia River system. So thank you for listening into this informational meeting. Conditions in the Flathead Basin for the past couple of water years, one very wet and one very dry, have generated a lot of questions and input from our stakeholders in the basin. Last year was really an unprecedented drought with record low flow at Columbia Falls. With such extreme conditions, the reservoirs will inevitably look different in years like last year, and managing water operations during drought is often complex and it's challenging. If we see drought operations through that lens, then I can only imagine how perplexing they may be for you. Some of the feedback that we received suggested just that. Therefore, it led us to develop these presentations in collaboration with our partners so that we could provide you with some insight about how Hungry Horse fits into the Columbia River system, the physical and the legal constraints, the governance operation, and the process for implementing any changes to planned operations. These presentations are designed to give you an enhanced understanding of the factors that we take into account daily to manage operations, work with our partners, and also to give you an idea of what is controllable and what isn't in these situations. In water short years, there will be trade-offs between all of the needs in the basin. So by the end of this presentation, we hope that you'll understand the many purposes Hungry Horse supports, the delicate balances we aim to strike in operating the dam, and also the limited flexibilities that are available in water short years. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Runyon, who is a hydraulic engineer in our water management division here at Reclamation. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Runyon. I'm a hydraulic engineer for the Bureau of Reclamation, based out of the regional office in Boise, Idaho. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm a member of our water management group, and we're responsible for operating Hungry Horse Dam in coordination with our staff at the dam. I'm glad you could make this presentation and hope you'll find it useful in understanding more about reservoir operations in the Flathead Valley. The slide here I'm showing is an outline for today's presentation. I'll begin by talking about the history and timeline of Hungry Horse Dam. and then I'll hand it over to Eve James from Energy Keepers to discuss SKQ Dam. I'll also describe how Hungry Horse is a part of the larger Columbia River system. Then we have Cassie Underhill from the Army Corps of Engineers with us today to talk about local and system flood risk management, or FRM, operations at Hungry Horse and SKQ Dam. And next we'll hear from Leanne Allegretto, a hydrologist and meteorologist from the National Weather Service, and she'll talk about the unique weather conditions of both the last couple of years. Lastly, Eve and I will describe operations for water year 22 and 23 and provide an update for reservoir conditions this year. So I'll just begin by talking about specifics of Hungry Horse Dam. Starting off with a little background and history, some might wonder how Hungry Horse Dam got its name. Well, the year was 1901, and there was a severe winter, and unfortunately, both Tex and Jerry, a couple local freight horses, wandered off from their logging sled. But after about a month, the horses finally stumbled back into civilization, where they ran into a group of stunned loggers. The loggers nicknamed them Mighty Hungry Horses due to their obvious signs of starvation. I'm happy to report, though, after this extremely difficult ordeal, both Tex and Jerry went on to live happy, long lives. Tex pulling a wagon for the Kalispell Mercantile Company, and Jerry filling his time pulling the fire wagon for the town of Kalispell. Moving on to why Hungry Horse Dam was built. So World War II was going on at that point, and energy needs for our country were growing. The dam was built to regulate water into Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam to maximize electrical power production to support the war effort. The dam would also provide local energy for the Flathead Valley and flood risk management operations for local agricultural lands. The Congress authorized the project on June 5th, 1944, with reclamation finishing the detailed design after that, and construction beginning in 1948 and ending in 1953. So to utilize the abundance of electricity in the Flathead Valley in the 1950s, the Anaconda Aluminum Company built a plant in Columbia Falls, and at that time employed over 450 people, but that plant is no longer there. So this slide here provides some details for the dam. It's a 560-foot tall concrete arch dam. It was the fourth largest concrete dam in the U.S. when it was completed. The dam has a crest length of almost a half a mile long and required over 3 million cubic yards of concrete to build. Just for reference, that would fill up 77,000 garbage trucks concrete, so a lot of concrete. The reservoir created behind the dam has a total capacity of almost 3.5 million acre feet of water. The 3.5 million acre feet of water probably sounds like a lot, but for most people, it's really hard to understand what that means. This slide shows how the volume in a reservoir is measured in acre feet, which is essentially 1 acre of land covered in 1 foot of water. This is roughly equivalent to a football field covered with 1 foot of water. So as stated earlier, Hungry Horse has a capacity of approximately 3.5 million acre feet. Another common term in reservoir operations is discharge out of the dam. This is measured by a flow rate with units of cubic feet per second. The plot on the left shows the flow rate at the South Fork of the Flathead River. That's below Hungry Horse Dam. So in this plot, the last reading is measured 800 CFS, or cubic feet per second, indicated by that black arrow. A flow rate of 1 cubic feet per second can be thought of as a basketball moving by a point each second. So in this plot, 800 basketballs every second are passing this location. Hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more when I start talking about how water is released from Hungry Horse Dam on the next slide. So the dam has 3 ways of releasing water. So the first way is by using the 4-unit power plant. Each unit can release up to 3,000 CFS and generates about 107 megawatts each of power. The next way water is released is through the 3 hollow jet valves shown in the picture to the right, and that has a combined capacity of 14,000 cubic feet per second. That's 14,000 basketballs being released every second when operating at full capacity. Lastly, we have a ring gate spillway located in the left corner of the picture and shown in the black and white picture to the right. So the ring gate spillway has a capacity of 50,000 CFS, and the black and white photo is a picture of the spillway being used during the first time the reservoir filled after construction. Hungry Horse Dam has 5 primary uses among other ancillary uses. So these include flood risk management, which the Corps of Engineers will be talking about later, hydropower generation, I mentioned earlier, recreation, fish and wildlife conservation provided under the Endangered Species Act, and then also in-stream flow regulation. Before I get into specifics of Hungry Horse, I thought it'd be good to step back a bit and look at a regional map. This map shows the entire Columbia River Basin with parts of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and a small portion of Wyoming near Jackson Lake, as well as parts of Canada. As you can see, there are many federal and privately owned dams in the Columbia River Basin. This doesn't include everyone, but the major ones. Hungry Horse Dam and SKQ Dam are in the headwaters of the basin and indicated by the red dashed circle. So zooming back into the Flathead, I wanted to look at the numerous tributaries that come into the Flathead River above the city of Columbia Falls. The watershed above Columbia Falls is approximately 4,500 square miles. And then shortly above that location, the South Fork at 1,700 square miles comes in. So the South Fork is where Hungry Horse Dam is located. Above this, the river splits into the North Fork, which is 1,600 square miles, and then lastly, the Middle Fork, which is 1,100 square miles. So as you can see on the map, the proportion of the basin above Columbia Falls that is regulated by Hungry Horse Dam is approximately only 37% of the basin. So this means that although Hungry Horse can provide beneficial regulation for flood risk management, there are still 2 uncontrolled tributaries that can make operations challenging. The other purpose is flood risk management, both locally at Columbia Falls and then down on the main stem of Columbia River. I will let the Corps of Engineers tell you more about that later. And hydropower is another primary purpose. For context, the powerhouse is located at the base of the dam, shown in the middle of the top picture. The picture on the bottom right shows what the turbines look like inside the power plant, and the black and white picture on the bottom left shows the size of the scroll case that delivers the water into the turbine, one of the turbines. So these are big pipes. Each year, Hungry Horse generates about 1.4 million megawatt hours, which is enough to power about 140,000 homes. Last thing is transmission restrictions in the Flathead Valley limit the power produced at Hungry Horse to 310 megawatts. The area around Hungry Horse Dam offers excellent recreational opportunities. Reclamation works with federal, state, and local agencies to improve this recreation area. As you can see on the map of the reservoir, there are 3 different boat ramps, one near the dam, one about a quarter down the reservoir at Dorse Cove, and another one near the far end named Canyon Creek. So in addition to the boat ramps, there are also 10 different campgrounds, a couple of which are actually located on islands within the reservoir. Access to these facilities changes depending on how full the reservoir is or the time of year. But regardless, thousands of visitors come to this area to take part in fishing, boating, camping, water skiing, snowmobiling, hunting, to name a few. So cooperative efforts between Reclamation and the Forest Service has demonstrated our commitment to maintaining this valuable resource for future generations. Before I start talking about Hungry Horse Dam obligations for fish and wildlife conservation, I wanted to mention that the reservoir is just one of 14 federal projects located on the Columbia River system, as shown on the map to the right. Hungry Horse Dam is identified by the green dashed circle in the upper right-hand corner of the picture. So these 14 federal projects are operated as a coordinated system to meet multiple congressionally authorized purposes, including fish and wildlife conservation, and are located in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. So the furthest downstream dam in this system is Bonneville Dam. It's located on the Columbia River main stem and upstream of Portland, Oregon. So federal, tribal, and state governments hold jurisdictions over ESA-listed salmon, steelhead, bull trout, Kootenai River white sturgeon, and other aquatic species, and related water management issues across the Columbia Basin. The Technical Management Team, or commonly referred to as TMT, is a group of federal, tribal, and state government fish managers and reservoir operators that meets biweekly or weekly throughout the year, coordinating the Columbia River system, the operations, and ensuring the projects meet requirements and are adaptively managed to changes in in-season conditions in order to benefit ESA-listed species. So Reclamation, along with the state of Montana, are members of TMT, and Hungry Horse Dam operations are part of the Columbia River system. They're guided by multiple operational documents, including the 2020 CRS proposed action, annual fish operating plans, and annual water management plans. Montana Fish Accords were signed on May 2nd, 2008, between the state of Montana and action agencies. Action agencies are represented by the Army Corps of Engineers, BPA, and Reclamation. Montana Fish Accords provided funding for the permanent protection of resident fish habitat, through land purchases and conservation easements, primarily in northwest Montana. The Accords also allowed Hungry Horse to implement some of Montana's preferred operations to benefit resident fish. These operations included operations to stabilize flows downstream of the dam and to keep more water in the reservoir behind Hungry Horse Dam during the months of July through September. This has provided a significant benefit to resident fish living in the reservoir as well as resident fish living downstream of the reservoir. Hungry Horse is required to meet minimum flows below the dam on the South Fork and at the Flathead River at Columbia Falls. These minimums are discussed at TMT each year and are set by the March water supply forecast. The table on the slide shows how various April through August inflow forecasts, the minimum flows below the dam range from 400 to 900 CFS, and at Columbia Falls, they range from 3,200 to 3,500. Hungry Horse outflows are primarily controlled by these minimum flows starting in about late July through the initial runoff time, which can happen as early as April. For large water years, outflows from the dam may need to be higher to lower the reservoir elevation to meet deeper FRM requirements. During times when the stream flow at Columbia Falls is over this requirement due to inflow from the middle or north forks, minimum flows below Hungry Horse Dam on the South Fork dictate the outflow from the dam. So this has the added benefit of conserving water and keeping the reservoir higher, benefiting ESA-listed bull trout and other resident fish that live in the reservoir. In addition to minimum flows, the reservoir also provides what's called flow augmentation to support local and lower Columbia River ecosystem needs. Flow augmentation is water that is more than would have already been released, either for flood risk management or power. So similar to the minimum flow requirements, the amount of flow augmentation each year is also dependent on a forecast. In this case, it's the May through September forecast, and the amount of flow augmentation released is dictated by where the reservoir needs to be lowered to by the end of September. These end of September drafts range from 3540, which is 20 feet from full during drier water years, to 3550, which is 10 feet from full for wetter water years. Water release from flow augmentation benefits ESA listed bull trout and other resident fish species downstream of the dam. Lastly, this flow augmentation water is passed through SKQ Dam and downstream to the main stem Columbia River to help meet ecosystem needs on the lower Columbia. Flow augmentation from Hungry Horse Dam, including the timing and the volume, is coordinated with TMT each year. The last fish and wildlife operation I want to mention is for water temperature downstream of the dam. The picture on this slide shows what is called a selective withdrawal system. Essentially, this concrete structure located on the upstream face of the dam allows water to be drawn from various depths within the reservoir in order to target a water temperature downstream that is beneficial for resident fish downstream. Water temperature operations can begin in June and extend through September. The table on this slide shows a range of temperatures identified by the state of Montana as optimal for resident fish species below the dam. I'd like to now turn it over to Eve James, Director of Asset Optimization with Energy Keepers.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, my name is Eve James, and I'm here to present about Energy Keeper stewardship of Flathead Lake and the lower Flathead River. As mentioned, there are numerous dam reservoir projects in the Columbia River and its tributaries that are operated by federal and non-federal entities in the United States and Canada. As you can see in the upper right map, the Flathead Basin highlighted in yellow is one of the headwater basins that flows into the Columbia River system. Chris already detailed the different forks of the Flathead River above Columbia Falls, and there's additional smaller tributaries that impact the inflows into Flathead Lake above the Salish-Kasanka-Kalispay Dam, such as the Stillwater, Whitefish, and the Swan Rivers. On average, the annual flow as it leaves the basin near Kerma has a volume of 8.2 million acre feet. The top 10 feet of Flathead Lake are impounded by SKQ Dam. When the reservoir is full, the surface elevation is approximately 2,893 feet above sea level. From a reservoir operations perspective, the lake is empty at 2,883 feet. Flathead Lake is a big lake with approximately 30 miles long and 15 miles wide with a surface area of nearly 200 square miles. For reference, Lake Roosevelt and Lake Tahoe have about 125 and 190 square miles of surface area respectively. How much water is in a foot of storage in Flathead Lake? It's approximately 60 KSFD, which is 1,000 CFS of flow for a day, or using Chris's analogy, 60,000 basketballs of flow for a day. The whole 10 feet of storage holds a volume of 1.22 million acre feet. Chris mentioned that Hungry Horse has nearly 3.5 million acre feet of storage. However, because the surface area of Flathead Lake is so large, the water volume of 1 foot of storage in Flathead Lake equates to approximately 5.4 feet of storage at the Hungry Horse Reservoir. The Salish-Kasanka-Kalispay hydroelectric project is built on the sacred lands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai people. The lands it is located on were originally reserved by the Hellgate Treaty of 1855, and a Stevens Treaty is still in place today. These lands and waters reserved by CSKT's treaty are the center of their homelands and provide the spiritual sustenance for the perpetuation of the tribe and their culture. The Kerr project is the former name of the SKQ Dam and was developed as a result of federal assimilation policies implemented on the Flathead Indian Reservation from 1908 to 1934. There were applications for 5 power sites on the lower Flathead River within the Flathead Reservation. Only the Kerr Dam site was completed. In 1930, the Federal Power Commission issued the first 50-year license to the Rocky Mountain Power Company, who then transferred its license interest to the Montana Power Company. Kerr Dam began producing power in 1939. As the original 50-year license neared expiration, the tribe filed a competing application with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for the relicensure of Kerr. After a series of 1-year licenses, the tribe successfully negotiated co-licensee status with the option to acquire the project as the sole owner in 2015. The tribe created its energy enterprise named Energy Keepers Incorporated, or EKI, and on September 5th, 2015, it reacquired the project and changed the name to Salish Kasanka Kalispe Dam after the 3 tribes in the Confederation. Salish Kasanka Kalispe Dam is a concrete arch dam that is 381 feet long and 200 feet high. It has 3 generating units and 14 spill gates. On average, it produces 1.1 million megawatt hours of electricity, which is enough to power almost 110,000 homes every year. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, licenses and inspects non-federal hydropower projects through its authority under the Federal Power Act. In 1985, a 50-year license was issued to the Montana Power Company and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, or CSKT, as co-licensees. There are 80 articles total in the license. The current license includes the Secretary of Interior's conditions for the protection and utilization of the Flathead Reservation, submitted pursuant to the Section 4E of the Federal Power Act. Flathead Lake and the Lower Flathead River are major historical and cultural water resources for CSKT, and 25 mitigation articles were added in 1996 as 4E conditions to protect tribal resources from the project's impacts. I will explain a few key license articles that cover the lake and flow levels. Article 43 allows the licensee to regulate Flathead Lake between elevations 2883 feet and 2893 feet in accordance with the 1962 Flood Control Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, as amended in 1965 between the Montana Power Company and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The MOU calls for certain lake elevations at different times of the year, primarily to address flood risk management. The if conditions allow language is to recognize that the Flathead Lake elevation and fill rate are not entirely in control of the SKQ owner and operator. The lake elevation is a function of inflows and the maximum outflow allowed by a natural stream channel restriction, which causes the outflows of the lake to be reduced at low lake levels. It is recognized that Flathead Lake can surcharge or overfill running to free flow because of the stream channel restriction. What impacts the stream channel capacity is the geology of the landscape, which in the Flathead and Mission valleys was impacted by major glaciation during the ice ages. After some earlier ice age, the Flathead River cut through a buried knob of hard Precambrian sedimentary rock to create a narrow gorge. The SKQ Dam was built at the north end of this gorge. Flathead Lake fills a basin where a large mass of stagnant ice lingered as the last ice age ended. Glacial deposits filled the valley floor elsewhere, but could not accumulate where the ice still lay. Before the construction of the SKQ Dam, the lake level naturally fluctuated throughout the year due to the channel-restricted outflows near where the Polson Bridge has been constructed today. After the construction of SKQ Dam, the lake elevation was raised and operates between 2883 and 2893 feet, which are shown in the dashed lines on this bottom graphic, which displays the Flathead Lake levels pre-dam. The darker gray lines show the elevations of the wettest natural spring runoff years, and the lighter gray lines have the driest spring runoff. So even before the dam was built, as the lake level decreased, the amount of water that passes through that natural stream channel near the Polson Bridge also reduced, which you can see in the upper right graphic, which displays the river flows of the Lower Flathead River near Polson before the dam was built. There was a large range of summer lake levels, with the blue line representing the median elevation for the USGS pre-dam data set. The lake elevation is a function of the flows into the lake and this maximum outflow allowed by the stream channel. So you can see historic instances where the lake level was much higher than 2893 feet. Even after the dam was built, the lake can surcharge or fill above 2893 because of the stream channel restriction, such as happened in June of 2022, which will be discussed in detail later. Now we move on to some of the mitigation articles for project flows. This chart shows the drastic hourly flow changes caused by Montana Power Company operations prior to any 4E mitigation conditions. You can see rapid flow changes of up to 10,000 CFS on some of these days. These flow changes were harmful to downstream aquatic species and habitat. Articles 55 to 58, which added ramping restrictions and minimum flow requirements, were added in 1996 to protect downstream aquatic habitat and fisheries. The gray line represents the maximum hourly flow change allowed in Article 58. Article 55 limits within-day ramping at the project to those changes required for water management. And Article 57 limits between-day flow changes. This chart shows the same September to December time period, but after the 4E ramping limitations were implemented. This has improved downstream fisheries. Article 56 of the license prescribes minimum flow requirements for downstream aquatic species and habitat. This graph shows the 6 driest spring runoff years in the pre-dam record flow. The blue line is the medium spring runoff for the pre-dam flow record of water year 1908 to 1937. And the dashed red line shows the Article 56 minimum flow requirement, which is below these low historic flows. Article 60 recognizes that there are some stream flow conditions where meeting the flood risk management elevations, filling the lake, and meeting the lower Flathead River minimum flow requirements cannot all be met. This license article allows for a plan to adjust the flood control obligations to facilitate compliance with the minimum in-stream flow requirements. A draft drought management plan was filed in 2002 by the previous owners with an environmental impact study completed in 2010. However, no record of decision was issued. The previous draft plan is over 20 years old, so EKI plans to file an updated draft drought management plan. Once the documentation is completed, it will be submitted to the Secretary of the Interior and filed with the Commission. EKI has maintained minimum in-stream flows and refilled the lake through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Flood Risk Management Deviations process. Article 68 requires erosion control across the Lazy and Ranch waterfowl protection area due to shoreline erosion impacts from keeping the lake full. Gravel beaches were built and the lake level must be reduced to an elevation of 2891 feet no later than October 31st to stop wave erosion from strong storms. These changes were successful in stopping the erosion loss, and habitat has increased in this area by over 20 acres since 2015. The Flathead River is a headwater basin to the Columbia River system. So Cassie Underhill from the Army Corps of Engineers will describe the system and local flood risk management requirements.
Hello. Hi, my name is Cassie Underhill, and I'm with the Corps of Engineers, Columbia Basin Water Management. My team helps to set the flood risk management requirements for the basin, so that's what I'll be talking to you about today. So, going to start by introducing some concepts. The first is the seasonality and timeline of flood risk management. I'm going to call it FRM because I speak mostly in acronyms. FRM operations. The risk of flood happens from April to July, but we're setting ourselves up for that really early in the year. As this diagram on the left shows, we are starting out with this yellow arrow here, trying to make space for floodwater from December to April. So we really rely on these early guesses for how much water we're going to get. So December to April, we're drafting or drawing down the amount of water in the lake. The amount of drafts usually depends on the water supply volume forecast, which is our best guess about how much water is going to be coming towards the dam. Then the reservoirs refill when the water's running off, or about April to May, to capture that floodwater and lower that peak downstream. That transition to refill is that red arrow on this cycle. And then the blue arrow shows the refill period. There's a lot going on during that refill period. In normal to large years, too quick of a refill will leave downstream locations vulnerable because the risk of flooding possibly hasn't passed yet. So I mentioned flood events. There's a couple different mechanisms that can cause emergency situations in the basin: snowmelt and rain. So while snowmelt may be a little easier to predict because we can see the snow building, how it comes off can be really interesting. If we see a quick warm up in the basin due to temperature, or it gets quickly melted by rain, it can come off really fast. With atmospheric rivers or rain events that are atmospheric rivers, those are very unpredictable because we often only know a few days ahead of time about where they're going to point and about how intense they're going to be. But remember, we have to make those decisions about what the reservoir levels will need to be to capture that water months in advance. So now I'll cover the difference between a couple of different types of flood management that we do: local and system FRM. Columbia Falls, as previously mentioned, is an important point for flood risk management, and it's a good example of what local FRM looks like. Local FRM is focused on a specific location and typically controlled by one or maybe two dams. So this example here, Columbia Falls flood stage is 13 feet when Flathead Lake elevation is at or above elevation 2892 feet, and 14 feet if less than 2892 feet. System FRM is prescribed for the larger Columbia River, and it looks at all of the upstream dams in a more holistic way. System FRM typically benefits from local FRM because if you're lowering the peaks for those upstream locations, it's typically also lowering the peaks downstream. The Northwestern Division that I work for handles both the Columbia and Missouri rivers, which are two of the country's largest. This green area represents the watershed for the Basin, which is huge. It's approximately the size of France. And note that a large portion of our average flow, 35% or so of the average annual flow, comes from British Columbia. So all these dots on this map, and this isn't even all of the dams, represent a lot of the projects that we work with and a lot of project owner or operators with whom we work. So this watershed system is operated for many purposes. Flood risk management is just one of them. On this plot on the right-hand side, these dots are sized by reservoir storage and then color-coded by project operator or owner. You can tell that a lot of our storage to manage the flooding that we do actually is in Canada. So we not only work with multiple agencies, we also work closely with another country. The plot on the left shows the amount of flood storage in the basin compared to the amount of water we see each year. And I've got a little Canadian flag there to denote the Canadian storage. The ratio of the amount of runoff that we get compared to the amount of storage that we actually have in the Columbia River Basin is the opposite of what we see in our other major systems in the US. We have a lot less storage than we do water coming at us. The system of flood risk management dams was designed to control a flood similar to the 1894 event and reduce that peak flow that was seen there of 1.2 million CFS to 800,000 CFS. But I want to note that 800,000 CFS is a lot of water still. That's very much still a flood. Montana reservoirs can provide about 5 MAF at Libby, 3 MAF at Hungry Horse, and about 1.2 MAF at Caliste. At Libby and Hungry Horse, that full amount isn't typically requested. That's just in wet years. At SKQ and then Albany Falls, here also, guide curves for those projects use the entire active capacity. However, natural channel restriction that Eve mentioned may prevent evacuation to full storage capacity in some years. So I mentioned that Hungry Horse doesn't always use that full authorized flood space in every year. At that dam, to determine how much space is needed to capture floodwater, we use storage reservation diagrams. This plot is a generalized example of what that looks like and how we use it through the draft period. And again, at some reservoirs, like SKQ, that amount of flood space needed doesn't vary depending on water supply forecast. It's just a fixed amount every year. However, at Hungry Horse and also Libby, the flood space needed varies depending on how much runoff is forecasted. So this red line shows an example of what that might look like over the course of the year. So at the beginning of the year, we may expect that it's going to be pretty wet, say in December. Then the forecast maybe starts looking a little less wet, and we think it's average. Then in April, it looks like it's actually going to be somewhere between an average and a wet year, kind of wettish. And that's our final guess because in May, the snow, April, May-ish, the snow starts melting off and it's time for refill. Our final output for flood risk management looks pretty simple. It's just a table. I've circled the projects that we are focusing on today in red here. HGH stands for Hungry Horse because, like I said, we speak in acronyms. These are publicly accessible at the link below and published every month. You can also find it by Googling Columbia River Flood Risk Management Corps of Engineers, or some variety of those terms. And as we go through the water year, my team is refining what the flood risk management requirements are at each dam. This mostly looks like an upper elevation, which is what most of these numbers are here, that the reservoirs can be at each month. So at Hungry Horse, the FRM elevations are set from January until refill, and after that, the flood risk management is set by a minimum flow requirement. So right now that's represented by TBD because we calculate them when we get a little closer to refill. At SKQ, that FRM never changes from year to year. You'll see 15 April 2883 and then 30 May 2890. However, big caveat here, again, that channel capacity may not allow for that reservoir to get down to that FRM elevation in every year. Also, as Eve mentioned, in some years, we work with EKI, sorry, Eve, to evaluate the risk of alternative FRM through a process we call a deviation, where we analyze the flood risk of a different operation. So next up, Leanne will be covering water year conditions. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Leanne Allegretto. I am a meteorologist and the acting service hydrologist at the National Weather Service office located in Missoula, Montana. And I'll be discussing Northwest Montana's weather and stream flow conditions for both water years 2022 and 2023. And before I get into it, the setup for both water years 22 and 23, both winters leading up to these springs were La Nina winters. And despite them both being La Ninas, we saw drastically different behavior between the two La Nina seasons. And whenever that happens, we tend to see changes in snowpack towards the end of the year, which happens around the April-May timeframe. So I'm going to start by showing the snowpack numbers at the beginning of April, April 1st, 2022, and compare them to the snowpack numbers for April 1st, 2023, because as we go along, we're going to see that there's a very big difference between the 2 years. So this first image is the subbasins of Northwest Montana and the periphery areas. And this graph here shows the snow water equivalent % of normal as of the date of April 1st, 2022. Now, snow water equivalent, what does that mean? That means the amount of snow, if we were to take all the snow in that subbasin and melt it down, that is the amount of water held within that snow and how it compares to what it should be at that time of year. So as we can see, April 2022, at the beginning of the month, we had quite a bit of at or slightly above normal snowpack. We had 92% leading into Hungry Horse, 100%, 106, 102, 91, all really good numbers. Then as you get to April 1st of 2023, we see a little bit of a difference start to show. And again, this is the snow water equivalent, or SWE, as we sometimes refer to it as. And the numbers here at the start of the month are quite a bit lower. So 83%, 86%, 91, 102 is over here, and 103. So, okay, not great. But as we start to see the snowpack progress and we compare the start of May of 2022 to the start of May 2023, that's where we see the drastic changes. And what I've highlighted here is, again, snow water equivalent % of normal as of May 1st. And the basins in and around the Continental Divide and leading out of Canada are between about 110% to 122% of normal. So very good. We like to see those numbers. The basins right here are 226% of normal. Now, there's a caveat to this. As we get later and later in the spring melt-off season, these numbers tend to get a little skewed. So the lower elevation basins, such as these two darker blue, royal blue colors, they're 226% of normal. That would make someone think like, whoa, they have a ton of snow. Well, they're lower elevations. So the longer that lower elevations hang on to snow, the more skewed that number seems to be, the more exaggerated it is. But really, it's just lower elevation, and it's holding on at lower elevations, which should be warmer compared to the higher terrain. So keep that in mind as we go forward to May 1st, 2023. And here we have like the big reveal, right? Things are not right as of May 1st, 2023. Those two lower elevation basins have completely melted out. The basins I mentioned coming out of Canada and hanging along the Continental Divide spine that drain into Flathead Lake are well below normal. They're ranging between 69% and 83% of normal. And we're still hanging on to near or at normal south of Flathead Lake. So by the end of May 2022, when we really start to see our snow melt season progressing, we are still hanging on to quite a bit of snow. We've got 154%. Again, these basins have melted out. 138% along the divide, 132, 143, 128, all really good. Great signs. But by the end of May 2023, we have just about depleted our snowpack. And that's when we start to see numbers of anything below 20, 30% of normal for this time of year. So we have very little snow to melt out at this point. And that really played a factor into conditions for the remainder of 2023. So what exactly happened? What made it so different? Well, it was a combination of factors. Like I mentioned, April and May of 2023 were warmer, and they were warmer much sooner than those same months in 2022. The rate of melting was accelerated in 2023 as a result, and our stream flows responded accordingly. And I'll show that as we get towards the last few slides of this presentation. So one major factor that we have to take a look at when we're talking about snowmelt is temperatures. So I want to compare April of 2022, which is the graphic on the left, with April of 2023 graphic on the right. Now, this particular data set has been gathered from the Kalispell Glacier International Airport ASOS sensor. But if you were to look at West Glacier, Hungry Horse, all of the surrounding observation units, all of them reflected the same trend. So don't think that I'm just showing you one point and that's the hottest point. All of them were reflective of the pattern I'm going to show you. So in the red box over here for April, the key thing I want to show is for normal, our average for this unit, April 2022, should be about 55%. We ended up at 48.9% average for the temperatures, the maximum temperatures that month. So bottom line, we were cooler than average for the month of April in 2022. If you look at April of 2023, same thing. Normal is 55%, and we topped out right at normal, 55.1 degree. I'm sorry, I said percent, it's degrees, 55 degrees. Average, we ended up with 55.1. So all things considered, not bad. And then there's May. So May of 22 is on the left. May of 23 is on the right. Still reporting site of Kalispell Glacier International Airport. The normal temperature for May is 65.1. That year in 22, we ended up at 60.3 degrees. So slightly cooler than normal. Now, May of 2023, we started off at 86 degrees. We remained in the 80s. We had a slight cool down, and then we ramped back up again into the 80s and kind of hung around in that above average temperature range for the bulk of the month. And that resulted in an average temperature that was well above normal for that time of year. Again, 65 degrees was the normal. We ended up with 72.7. So a very warm month. Another thing to note is precipitation. What did we accumulate? Not much. There's a lot of zeros here. And most of our precip fell in one 24-hour period of 1 inch. And that's just not going to cut it. We need more than that. If we're going to be warm, we should at least be adding to the snowpack, or at least rain on snow, something to give us something to run off in the spring. That just was not the case. So you've heard Flathead River at Columbia Falls mentioned in the previous presentations. This is our key river gauge that we tend to look at that flows into Flathead Lake. This is a look at the stream gauge behavior, the stream flow behavior as of May of 22. And you see Throughout the month, we have those pulses where it gets warm, there's increased runoff, it cools down, decreases a little bit, so on and so forth. This is a fairly normal looking stream flow for this gauge. If we look at the same gauge, May of 2023, you'll see it's almost reflective of the temperature trends that I pointed out. We had a warm start to the month. There's a lot of runoff. We cooled down a little bit. The runoff kind of eased up a bit. We got some rain. It got warm again. And then the point I want to drive home here is that it just kept melting and melting and melting. And the runoff got lower and lower and lower. And this line here shows June 1st. And by that point, we just ran out of runoff. And that was the trend for going into June. So that begs the question, where do we sit here in 2024? This graph was taken March 7th, and the snow water equivalent is not great, but we're doing better in the Flathead than we are for the rest of the state and essentially the rest of Western Montana. We're currently sitting at about 73%, 84%, 92% in this basin, 82, 96 in those lower elevation basins. So not ideal, but we still have plenty of time. We have at least through April to try and get those numbers up with additional snow or rain on snow as we get into May, and not all hope is lost. Thank you for listening. If you have any local questions, please reach out to me at the information there, and I will turn it back to Chris for more.
All right, thanks, Leanne, for that summary of basin and weather conditions. So now that I covered the primary uses of Hungry Horse Dam earlier, including flood risk management, hydropower generation, recreation, and fish and wildlife conservation, I will now talk about the actual Hungry Horse Dam operations for water year 22 and water year 23. I'll be showing this slide a few times throughout this presentation because it does a really good job of explaining the difference between these 2 years. The top plot shows the snowpack in the South Fork of the Flathead Basin, which is where Hungry Horse is located. This can be seen in the figure in late April, shown by the dashed circle. Water year 2022, shown in the blue line, and water year 2023, shown in the red line, are similar. The green line is average snowpack. And as you can see in late April, both water year 22 and 23 are near this line. The plot below shows the estimated natural stream flow at the Flathead River at Columbia Falls. This plot was created by removing the impact of the dam's outflow, and it helps to show the different shape and timing of the natural runoff. Columbia Falls is the location we talked about earlier, because of its importance of minimum flow requirements as well as location for flood risk management operations. So in late April, like the snowpack above, spring flow between these years and average conditions are similar, showing runoff just beginning to increase as the low elevation snowpack begins to melt off. But as most of you on this call are aware, weather and conditions after this for these 2 years ended up with 2 drastically different runoff scenarios. So I'll jump into talking about Hungry Horse operations for water year 22. In late April, as shown by the earlier snowpack plot, conditions were similar between 22, 23, and average. This figure, produced by the Northwest River Forecast Center out of Portland, provides a forecast of the expected monthly volumes on May 1, and as shown in the yellow box and whisker symbols. What made water year 22 unique was that the month of May ended up being very cool, which delayed the runoff, and therefore the observed value shown by the blue box ended up being less than the expected. So in June, conditions changed dramatically. Our volume in June was close to twice of what it would have been expected based on the snowpack and conditions on May 1. May through July precipitation ended up being 140% of average, with the month of June being 200% of average. So it was an extremely wet month. Before I get into the specific operations for that year, I want to take some time to explain how to interpret the plots that I will be showing, as well as Eve. First off, inflow, or the amount of water coming into the reservoir, is shown by the blue line. Outflow, or the amount of water released from the reservoir, is shown by the orange line. The red dotted line represents the stream flow at the Flathead River at Columbia Falls, which you've heard about earlier is our flood control point. Lastly, the dashed black line represents the reservoir elevation, and its value is depicted on the right axis. So as can be seen in the reservoir elevation from January through April, the reservoir elevation decreases due to the amount of water being released from the reservoir is greater than what was coming into the reservoir, or the inflow. For example, the orange line was above the blue line. So this same plot will be shown a few times during my presentation, as well as a similar plot shown by Eve. So here's water year 22. Starting from the left side of the plot, in January, the reservoir continued to lower as it met minimum flow requirements at Columbia Falls, and to reduce the likelihood of spill due to O&M requirements at the dam. So the term spill is used to describe the amount of water needed to be released more than what can be released through the power plant, and that can cause higher levels of total dissolved gas below the reservoir, which can be impactful to fish. By April 30, the reservoir drafted about 15 feet below what was required for flood risk management to help with this TDG concern. In early June, things got wet in the Flathead Basin, and inflows began to increase dramatically, as shown in the plot early to mid-June. Outflows from the dam reduced the minimum flow for a short duration in mid-June, as shown in the orange line, to provide a reduction in flood flows at Columbia Falls. This was an extremely busy time where coordination with the Flathead Emergency Operations Center, Army Corps of Engineers, National Weather Service, and Energy Keepers was critical. After the reservoir refilled by early July, outflows were gradually decreased to provide gradually decreasing flow at Columbia Falls to benefit the invertebrate food base for the fishery downstream. And lastly, Hungry Horse ended its flow augmentation delivery at the end of September. So as mentioned on the last slide, the month of June experienced extremely wet weather conditions, with flooding occurring in many locations in Montana. In the Flathead specifically, while the valley was experiencing flooding, as depicted in the picture on the lower right, the local ski resort was still picking up snow. This primarily was caused by a series of large low-pressure weather systems impacting the Northwest region, and depicted by the graphic in the lower right that was captured during this time. Although flood impacts were experienced in the Flathead Valley, fortunately, the Flathead did not get hit as hard as the Yellowstone, where stream flow broke a record set back in 1918 of 32,000 cubic feet per second, with a new record of 50,000 cubic feet per second. That stream flow, the stream flow experienced at that location in 2022 was approximately 1.6 times larger than that 1918 record. So this was a massive storm, to say the least. This plot shows the daily average stage or elevation of water for the month of June at that Columbia Falls gauge. So the dashed line shows an estimated natural stage at Columbia Falls when the operation from Hungry Horse Dam is removed. The solid line shows what the actual stage was at Columbia Falls during the month of June. This plot shows how the operation of the dam for FRM was able to keep the peak flow lower. As mentioned earlier, the amount of watershed above the Columbia Falls that is regulated by Hungry Horse Dam is only 37% of the basin. So it can't control all the stream flow, but it does help to keep flood flows lower than they would have been, and does reduce economic impacts due to flooding. The natural stream flow past Columbia Falls for the month of June was 157% of average, and it was the second largest volume in the historical record dating back to 1952. The Flathead River at Columbia Falls was above flood stage of 13 feet for 2 weeks, and the average daily peak was 14.6, where the average daily natural stage would have been 16.8 feet. Hungry Horse filled 20 feet since the 1st of June, and we filled to within 1 foot of full by the flood event. So next I'll talk about water operations for water year 2023. Here's the same plot I showed earlier, highlighting similar conditions between water year 22-23, an average in late April. That's when we saw those warm temperatures really picking up in 2023. So as I spoke about for water year 22, it was an extremely wet spring. It resulted in significantly high stream flows, and it caused impacts from flooding. But let's see how 2023 played out. Here's that expected monthly volumes on May 1 of 2023. As can be seen in the plot for the month of May, the forecasted volume identified by the small red line was very close to the actual observed line, shown by the blue bar. Unlike 2022, the bed experienced extremely wet June. Water year 2023 was practically the opposite, where actual volume ended up being about half of what was forecasted. So this was due to the extremely dry May through July period that only averaged 55% of median for precipitation. Here's a plot of the 2023 natural stream flow at Columbia Falls, shown in the thick red line, as well as every year since 1952. As can be seen in the plot, stream flow for 2023 increased in early May, but by late May began quickly decreasing into historical lows. These historically low stream flows continued through June, July, and August, and stream flow kept decreasing starting in late May due to the lack of precipitation in the basin that typically augments the melting snowpack. So here's the water operations summary plot for the dam in 2023. So starting from the left side of the figure, from October through early April, the dam was operated to multiple objectives, including minimum flows at Columbia Falls and providing reservoir elevations that would allow for the replacement of a culvert at a critical road crossing located along the south side of the reservoir. The reservoir began refilling in early April, and by late May, as conditions became extremely dry with very little rain in the basin, outflows began decreasing in an attempt to refill the reservoir, but unfortunately the weather continued to be extremely dry. By the middle of June, the reservoir was near its peak elevation, and the operation was coordinated to hold outflows from the reservoir to steady rather than to drop them down further to fill the reservoir completely. The main reason this operation was recommended was due to the outflows from the dam that would be needed to meet Columbia Falls minimum later in the summer. So if outflows from the dam would have been reduced to fill the reservoir at that time, they would have only needed to be increased back up later to meet Columbia Falls minimum flows. And this can actually have impacts on the invertebrate food base of the resident fishery downstream. Montana prefers to avoid this up and down outflow, commonly referred to as double peaking. Delivery of the flow augmentation ended by the end of September. So in summary, for what started with a near average snowpack in late April, ended up resulting in a significantly below average runoff where the reservoir did not completely refill. Stated earlier, complete refill of the reservoir was sacrificed to keep flows down at Columbia Falls a more constant flow to benefit resident fish. So we'll talk now about Hungry Horse operations so far for water year 2024. Here's the same plot. Getting familiar with this. So conditions for water year 2024 are now included and shown in the black line for March 13th. snowpack is currently below both 2022 and 2023, although it's important to note that on average, we have until late April to build snowpack in the basin, so a lot can still change. Stream flows have been elevated above last year's level, which has helped conserve water and keep Hungry Horse elevation higher than last year. Here's current monthly volume distribution for Hungry Horse. It's showing near average for the month of March and April, but below average for May through July. The current reclamation forecast for Hungry Horse is 76% of average right now. And although current conditions are indicating a below average runoff, as we have seen earlier, a lot can change based on weather conditions experienced in the spring. So we'll be continuously updating our forecast as we move through the season. Here's a plot of the Hungry Horse Reservoir pool elevation with water year 2024 in the black color. And as you can see in the plot, water year 24 has similar storage as in water year 22 and much more storage than last year, water year 2023. So as said before, our forecast is currently 76% of average. And the reservoir refill is likely, but I would say is not 100%, as there are still extremely low snowpack values in the far end of the basin and historical years with runoff that would not completely refill the reservoir. We still have until early May to build snowpack, and as shown earlier, spring operations are highly dependent on the weather we experience in May through July. So if you'd like to find more information about Hungry Horse operations, you can visit our webpage at www.usbr.gov/PN/. On this webpage, you will be able to find a recording of this entire presentation, a list of commonly asked questions and answers, as well as links to other agency websites, including the Corps of Engineers, the National Weather Service, and Energy Keepers, to find more information on SKQ Dam. For more specific information from Reclamation, you can always email us at the address below. And thank you for your time, and I hope you found this presentation helpful in understanding how Hungry Horse Dam is operated. I'll now hand it back over to Eve to talk about operations at SKQ.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So Chris touched on the South Fork conditions for Hungry Horse, and this graphic displays the water content of the snowpack for the broader Flathead Basin. So you can see the conditions at the start of April of 2022 and 2023 are similar, with, again, vastly different summer flow outcomes. As Chris and Leanne mentioned, the precipitation in mid-June of 2022 resulted in the lake overfilling. And the brown line shows the data for water year 2022. So you can see how the cooler temperatures slowly melted the snowpack until mid-July, sustaining higher natural summer flows into the lake. Whereas looking at the darker green line representing water year 2023, hot temperatures in May rapidly melted the snowpack by mid-June, and June precipitation was below normal, resulting in a record low natural inflow into the lake for the summer. This graphic shows the detailed information for Flathead Lake. It's similar to Chris's graphic where you can see the lake elevations in the black dashed line, with the reservoir minimum and maximum elevations in the dashed gray lines. Inflow into the lake is shown in blue, and the outflow is shown in orange, with the red dashed line showing the minimum flow requirements for the lower Flathead River. In 2023, June precipitation resulted in lake inflows that exceeded the maximum outflow through that restricted natural stream channel, which resulted in the lake filling above the 2893 feet. In 2023, we saw opposite conditions, where EKI had to coordinate flood risk management deviations with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to fill the lake in May due to the rapid snowmelt and early runoff. But by mid-June, the inflow into the lake was lower than the required minimum projected outflows. So after briefly touching full in mid-June, the lake level began to decrease. By the end of August, the lake was approximately 30 inches below full pool to support those minimum flow requirements. Over 20 complaints were filed with FERC over the summer of 2023, asserting that EKI mismanaged the lake and did not comply with the project license. FERC conducted a thorough review of EKI's operations and communicated the results to EKI in a 7-page letter on February 5th of 2024. FERC concluded that EKI complied with the operational requirements of the license in the summer of 2023. So looking forward to this season, Chris focused on the South Fork conditions, and this graphic shows the broader Flathead Basin conditions. So the current snowpack conditions for water year 2024 can be seen in the black line. They are much lower than the conditions of water year 2022 and 2023. In this upper right chart, you can see the 14 snowtail sites that provide the data for this overall Flathead Basin plot of the volume of water in the snowpack. 10 of the snowtail sites impact the tributaries that provide the natural flow into the lake, and 4 of the sites on the lower part, the Sleeping Woman, Stewart Mountain, North Fork, Jocko, those ones specifically impact the inflows into the lower Flathead River and do not contribute to the Flathead Lake inflows. So you can see where the snowpack is closer to normal near the Hungry Horse Reservoir, but it's below average in some of the other areas of the basin. This is the water supply volume forecast that is from the Portland office for natural flows into the Flathead Lake. And so you can see in these box whisker plots the forecast moving forward. And the blue boxes up to March are the observed runoff, and the red line is represents the forecast. The green dots show the 30-year average, so you can see that the forecasted flows are below the 30-year average. I've added pink boxes that represent the runoff volume needed to meet the minimum flow requirements for the lower Flathead River. And then the gray boxes is the maximum storage available for flood risk management. So right now the forecast is sitting above the flow volumes needed to meet these minimum flows for the lower Flathead River and the maximum storage allowed for flood risk management. So the SKQ dam will release flows higher than the minimum flow requirements as needed to remain in compliance with flood risk management objectives. The springtime weather and stream flow forecasts are volatile, so we frequently model and coordinate operations closely with the Corps and the Bureau. And so if an early runoff is detected like last year, we will again coordinate flood risk management deviations as needed to refill the lake. This graphic shows the lake levels for water years 2022 in black, water year 2023 in red, and water year 2024 shown in blue. So right now the current lake level is higher than normal for this time of year as we monitor the snowpack and forecast conditions for the runoff period. Please visit our website for news updates and lake level forecasts. And that concludes the presentations for this evening. And I'd like to turn the meeting back over to Brian Lipscomb and Jennifer Carrington to share their closing thoughts.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you all for some excellent presentations this afternoon and evening. I hope all of those attending found today's presentations informative. They're designed to give you a good basis of understanding of the water conditions in 2022, 2023, and what we're currently seeing for 2024. And really to note the extreme opposites we saw for 2022 and 2023. I think it's important to appreciate that as we continue to progress to a warmer climate, that path to get there is not always going to be smooth and peaceful as one might come to conclusion looking at the temperature plots that we see on the local news or the evening news nationally or discussed globally. Instead, what we expect and in fact have experienced are we're going to get ever-growing extremes that are around those averages. And so a few examples. As we came out of the El Nino of 2016 and went into an immediate La Nina cycle, in October of 2016, we had rainfall in the Flathead Basin that exceeded 300% of average. In June of 2021, we had temperatures in the Northwest that exceeded temperatures ever recorded. For example, in Lytton, British Columbia, we saw 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a temperature never experienced in British Columbia prior to that date. As a side note, of course, a forest fire engulfed Lytton, BC a couple weeks later. In August of 2021, the extreme weather conditions that drove the Boulder 2700 fire from halfway up the Mission Mountains to the shores of Flathead Lake, driven by, in the middle of the night, 90-degree temperatures and wind gusts that exceeded 60 miles an hour. And then in 2023, of course, we don't have to remember too far back to recall the extreme fire conditions that we saw the latter part of the summer with the 3 fires in the southwest part of the Flathead Indian Reservation, and then just off the reservation in Paradise, where the fire started in the valley floor and extended up both sides of the canyon, jumping the Clark Fork River and highways, going both directions. So those extremes are going to be part of our picture going forward. So in spite of these changes, though, our homelands here in Western Montana continue to be a beautiful place. That's something we should keep that in mind. They were prior to these climatological impacts that we see today, and they will be long after the changes that are yet to come have materialized. The challenge to us as humans is how we adjust and remain resilient. So I hope that that's where we continue and start to focus our efforts. We'll continue to provide updates to our forecast as we progress through the year and provide links to today's webinar on our website. Thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to additional discussions going forward. Jennifer?
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate those final thoughts. And again, thanks to all of the folks that presented today. Really appreciate it. I know that was a lot of information for all of you that are on the call to digest, and I know that you will have a lot of questions. And so we've developed a frequently asked questions section on the Reclamation website that we'll share at the end of this presentation. So, you know, as I've said, we've communicated a lot of material here this evening, and I'd like to emphasize a few points for you to consider taking away as we enter the current water year. Reclamation has to operate Hungry Horse Dam to meet multiple obligations, including flood risk management and fish and wildlife conservation under the Endangered Species Act. And it has to do so in a dynamic, unpredictable environment with the input of multiple federal, state, and tribal regulatory agencies, including those represented on the technical management team that Chris talked about. Current operations, including those developed through the Montana Fisher Course, have helped stabilize flows and keep more water in Hungry Horse Reservoir during the months of July, August, and September, providing significant benefits to resident fish above and below the dams. On the other hand, releasing more water and decreasing storage at Hungry Horse Reservoir in the fall and winter, that can impact the reliability of reservoir reflow and can impact resident fish species in the reservoir. The current forecast above Hungry Horse Reservoir is 76% of average, but as you have seen tonight, conditions in May through July can really dictate whether or where the water supply ends up for this year. As conditions develop, we'll continue keeping you and other stakeholders informed. Again, we really appreciate your time today and interest in effectively managing water resources in the Flathead Basin. So, Eve, if you could share the last slide in the slide deck here, this provides our contact information and the link to a recording of this session, as well as those frequently asked questions that I refer to. So again, on behalf of all of us tonight, thank you for joining us, and that concludes this presentation. Thanks, everyone.